Ḥayy ibn Yaqẓān by Ibn Tufail, page 132. Regarding all bodies, living and non-living, in the same light, Hayy saw that the being of each of them was made up in the same way of corporality, plus some factor or factors. Before him loomed the forms of physical things in all their diversity. This was his first glimpse of the spiritual world, for these forms cannot be apprehended by the senses, but only by reasoning. And as he was awakening to these things, it dawned on him that the animal spirit, which lives in the heart, and at which he had first probed with his dissections, must itself have a principle over and above its corporality, which would enable it to carry out all its wonderful tasks as true subject of the various modes of sensing, apprehending, and moving. This is the form which differentiates it from all other bodies. Philosophers term it the animal soul. The same holds for plants. Whatever they have to fill the role of body heat in animals would have its own special form, called by philosophers the vegetative soul. And even inanimate objects, that is, all the things in the world of generation and decay, besides plants and animals, must have some special thing to make them behave in their own peculiar way and give them their particular qualities to the senses and their ways of moving. This is the form, or as philosophers call it, the nature of the thing. When Hayy understood, through this line of reasoning, that the substance of animal spirit, toward which all his love had been directed, was compounded out of the corporal factor and another non-physical factor, and that it had the former in common with every other body, while the latter linked with it belonged exclusively to this spirit, he felt contempt for physicality. He dropped the physical, and his mind fastened on the other factor, which is simply called the soul. He was now anxious to learn all he could about the soul. Turning his thought in this direction, he started off by going over in his mind all physical objects, considered not as bodies but as having forms from which emerge their distinguishing characteristics. Following this up in many specific cases, he was able to see how great a number of bodies participate in a certain form, from which emanates a given mode or given modes of behavior. Within this group of subclass, besides sharing the form of rest, has an additional form from which further functions emerge. A still smaller class displays both of these plus a third form, generating still more special behavior. For example, everything earthen, such as soil, rocks, minerals, plants, animals, and all other heavy objects, makes up a single totality, which participates in a single form, from which issues the tendency to fall when unimpeded or when lifted and let go. Plants and animals are a subclass of this group. But besides sharing this form with all the rest, they have an added form from which emanate the activities of nutrition and growth. Nutrition is an interchange by which the being nourished replaces matter that breaks down by ingesting material similar to itself and assimilating this to its own substance. Growth is movement in all these dimensions at once, according to a set proportion. These two functions are universal among plants and animals, and must therefore issue from a form shared by both plants and animals. This form is what is called the vegetative soul. A still smaller subdivision, namely the animals, while sharing the first form with the whole group and the second with the subclass, surpasses both by the exclusive possession of a third form, which gives rise to sensation and locomotion. Further, Hayy knew that every animal species had its own distinguishing characteristics. He now understood that this differentiating principle stemmed from the species' own distinctive form, superadded to the form it held in common with all other animals. Each plant species had something similar. Plainly, some of the objects of sense perception in the world of generation and decay were made up of many factors over and above physicality, while others had only a few. He recognized that it would be easier to grasp the simpler than the more complex, so he decided to start with, to try to understand whatever had the fewest components to its makeup. Seeing that plants and animals must be composed of numerous factors because of the complexity of the tasks of life, he put off consideration of their forms for the present. By the same token, he observed that some pieces of earth were simpler than others, so he directed his attention to the simplest of these he could obtain. Likewise, he recognized that water must be very simple, since so few activities issue from its form. The same was true of fire and air. At first he had supposed not only that these four, fire, water, earth, and air, were interchangeable, but also that all partook of one common entity, that is, materiality, which was itself necessarily devoid of the factors which differentiate the four. This must neither rise nor fall. It must be neither hot nor cold, moist nor dry. For all these predicates are inapplicable to body qua body, since none is applicable to all bodies. Therefore, if an object could exist which had no form beyond physicality, not one of these predicates would be true of it, and no predicate at all could apply to it which did not apply to all physical things, regardless of their form. He searched for some one characteristic common to all objects, animate and inanimate, but the only thing he could find in all physical objects was extension in 3 dimensions. This he recognized belonged to physical things purely by virtue of the fact that they were physical. But his senses did not so readily reveal any object with just this attribute of extension, and no other. He then examined this notion of extension, asking himself whether it was just this that belonged to material things, or whether there was not perhaps some further principle. And he realized that behind extension there must be another factor in which extension itself was grounded. For bare extension could no more subsist by itself than the extended object could exist without extension. I tried out this idea on several form-bearing objects, such as clay, for example. He found that if he molded clay into some shape, for example into a ball, it had length, width, and depth in a certain ratio. If he then took this ball and worked it into a cube or egg shape, its length, width, and depth took on different proportions. But it was still the same clay, and no matter what the ratio, it could not be divested of length, breadth, and depth. The fact that one proportion could replace another made it apparent to him that dimensions were a factor in their own right, distinct from the clay itself, but the fact that the clay was never totally devoid of dimensions made it plain to him that they were part of its being. His experiments suggested to him that bodies qua body are really composed of 2 factors, one analogous to the clay of the example, the other to the length, width, and depth of the ball or block or other figure the clay might have. The truth was, he could not comprehend physical things at all, unless he conceived of them as compounded of these 2 factors, neither of which can subsist without the other. The variable factor, which can present a succession of many different faces, that is, extension, corresponds to the form of all other bodies. The other factor, which remains constant like the clay of the example, corresponds to materiality in all other bodies. In philosophy, the factor analogous to the clay is called the Hayy, or matter. It is entirely devoid of forms. When his thinking had risen to this level, and the sensory world had been left behind to some extent, just as he was mounting to a height from which he could gaze out toward the approaches of the world of mind, I felt alien and alone. He longed for the familiar world of the senses, balked at the notion of unqualified body, a thing he could neither perceive nor possess, and fell back on the simplest objects he could see, the 4 he had already singled out. He examined water first and found that if left to itself, determined only by its own form, it was perceptibly cold and downward-seeking. But if warmed by fire or the heat of the sun, first its cold would pass, leaving only its proclivity to fall. Then, if it were heated strongly, this too would vanish, and it would seek to rise, leaving it without either of the characteristics which had sprung from its form. Yet, all he knew of that form was that these functions issued from it. When they were gone, the rule of the form must have ended. The form of water must have left this body, since it now exhibited behavior characteristic of some other form. A new form, not previously present, must have come into being here, giving rise to behavior unlike that it had shown under its original form. Now Hayy knew by necessity that all that comes into being must have a cause. From this consideration he gained a vague and general notion of the cause of this form. One by one, he went over the forms he had known before and saw that all of them had come to be, and all must have a cause. He then considered that in which the forms inhere, and found it to be no more than a body's propensity for such, and such an action to arise from it. Water, for example, has a propensity to rise when strongly heated. This propensity is due to the form, for there's nothing there but body and certain perceptible things, qualities and ways of moving, for example, which come into being, and the cause who creates them. Thus, the proneness of a body to certain kinds of motion as opposed to others must be due to its disposition of form. Hayy realized that the same could be true of all forms. Clearly, the acts emerging from forms did not really arise in them, but all the actions attributed to them were brought about through them by another being. This idea to which he had now awakened is the meaning of the prophet's words, "I am the ears he hears by, and the sight he sees by," as is written in the unshakable revelation, "It was not you but God who killed them, and when you shot, it was not you who shot, but God." Possessing now a broad indistinct notion of this great subject, Hayy found himself a burning desire to know him more fully. But, having as yet not left the sensory world, he tried first to find this cause among the objects of his senses. Besides, he did not yet know whether he, God, was one or many. Accordingly, he scrutinized all the physical things he knew, unto which his thinking had always been confined. All of them, he perceived, develop and decay. Those which are not destroyed completely are destroyed at least in part. Water and earth, for example, are at least in part destroyed by fire. Air, too, he saw, can be destroyed by a severe chill and turned to snow or water. None of the physical things around him was exempt from change. Thus, none could exist without there being a cause of all this change. Seeing that this was the case, Hayy left behind all these things and turned his mind to the heavenly bodies. He reached this level at 28, having completed 4 7-year phases in his development. He knew that the heavens and all the stars in the skies were bodies because, without exception, they were extended in 3 dimensions, and whatever is always extended in 3 dimensions is a body. Therefore, they were all bodies. He wondered whether they extended infinitely in all directions or were finite, bounded at some point beyond which no extension was possible. The problem perplexed him more than a little, but ultimately his inborn talent and brilliance led him to realize that an infinite body is something spurious, which can neither be nor be conceived. This conclusion was bolstered in his mind by a number of arguments that he reached quite independently in the course of his reflections. "This heavenly body," he said to himself, "is bounded on the near side without doubt, since I can see it with my own eyes. Only the far side admits of doubt. None the less, I know it is impossible for it to extend forever. For if I imagine 2 lines beginning on this finite side, passing up through the body to infinity, as far as the body itself supposedly extends, and imagine a large segment cut from the infinite end of one, and the 2 placed side by side with the cut end of one opposite the uncut end of the other, and my mind travels along the 2 lines toward the so-called infinite end, then I must discover either that the pair of lines really do extend to infinity, the one no shorter than the other, in which case the cut line equals the intact one, which is absurd, or else that the one does not run full run the full length of the other, but stop short of the full course, in which case it is finite. But if the finite segment was subtracted and restored, the whole is finite. Now, it is neither shorter nor longer than the uncut line. They must be equal then. But one is finite, so the other must be finite as well. And so the body in which these lines were assumed to be drawn. Such lines can be assumed in any physical thing. Thus, to postulate an infinitely extended physical body is fallacious and absurd.